The Cold War was a time of tensions between the USA and the Soviet Union. It was characterized mostly by propaganda, espionage, and forms of brinkmanship. It lasted for about 50 years and resulted in a victory for the US and a fall of communist Russia. So let's take a look at how it all began. So it started first at the Yalta Conference, where Stalin promised that he would free up democratic elections in Russia, but then immediately went back on that at the Potsdam Conference when he just denied it, basically. So at this point, everyone in Europe, basically the big powers, Britain, France, US, Russia, all have a part of Germany as a result of World War II, because they're trying to keep it from unifying. But Russia just says, no, this part is ours, and they want to try and keep their part of Germany neutral as a buffer zone in case Germany and Russia ever go to war again. So in response, Winston Churchill gives his famous Iron Curtain speech, declaring that an Iron Curtain had descended upon East Europe, and that basically no one in that area could be trusted. So at the same time, the US had issued the Truman Doctrine, which basically stated that they were going to contain communism in Russia and not let it escape anywhere else. But the first communist action against the US was the Berlin Crisis, where Soviets began to push the Allies out of their part of Germany. And we decided to respond by giving the Berlin Airlift, which we basically sent hundreds of planes, basically one every 45 seconds landing in Berlin, to go give them supplies and food and help keep them Berliners. We also issued the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, in order to get allies on our side. And Russia then immediately issued the Warsaw Pact, which is basically their version of NATO. In 1949, the first failure of the Truman Doctrine occurs when Mao Zedong leads his Chinese Revolution and established the People's Republic of China. But it was communist, so it wasn't really a People's Republic, it was more of a government ruling everything Republic of China. And also in 1950, the Korean War begins as North Communists invade the South. The United Nations sends troops to back up the Southerners, also known as not communists, and then Russia sends in their Soviet troops to back up the communists. So after a lot of pushing back and forth, a lot of the United Nations dominating, the communists dominating, we basically reached the exact same point at which we started, making it a huge failure on both parts. When Stalin dies in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev, no idea how to say that name, hope I got it right, leads the Soviets. So he begins to de-Stalinize the USSR by denouncing Stalin's crimes. He says the Gauss plan to prove that communism was better than capitalism, rather than just going to war on everyone to show it. So he begins to meet with Britain and the US. Well, he also meets with France, but they don't really matter in this war. So at the Geneva Summit, to talk about security and disarmament, but that ultimately fails because no one can make any decisions. He also lets Austria become independent to help lower the tensions between the Allies and the Soviets. But in 1957, when they launched Sputnik into space, every good intention that Stalin had with the US was basically destroyed. Because now the US is starting to worry about how, missiles are going to be sent into space. So they begin this space race. And the USSR dominates this early on. They put Sputnik, the first satellite, into space. They put Laika, the first dog, into space. They also put the first man into space and the first woman into space. So they're basically destroying this. But the US decides that they're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. In 1959, when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong land on the moon, they just come out on top as the number one, space power. I don't know what that achievement is, but they got the first person on the moon. Fun fact, they got to the moon with less computing power than that of your standard iPhone. So, and to even furthermore destroy the relations between Khrushchev and the US, Khrushchev and Nixon start butting heads at the kitchen debate when Nixon starts to talk about how all their technologies are in their homes and stuff and how good that is. And then Khrushchev says, oh yeah, we all have all this stuff too and we're better than you, so yeah.
Thanks, Noah. I'll take it from here. Starting in the 1960s, sadly, the tensions in the Cold War in the 1960s only got worse. Starting with the U-2 incident in 1960, where a U-2 spy plane was shot over the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev demanded an apology from President Eisenhower, but of course, Eisenhower declined, and this greatly increased the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. After this incident was the next incident in 1961, known as the Berlin Wall. This wall was put up by the Soviet Union to keep East Germans from crossing over into West Berlin. Luckily, 2 million East Germans actually escaped into West Berlin before the wall was actually put up. The following year, 1962, was categorized by the very well-known Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets successfully deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is, of course, in launching range of the U.S., which is very terrible and could kill thousands of Americans. This crisis became the closest that the USSR and the U.S. ever came to nuclear warfare, but of course neither countries wanted to go to nuclear warfare because both of the countries had enough nuclear power to blow up the entire world. Luckily, this crisis ended with Khrushchev agreeing to remove his missiles from Cuba so long as the U.S. removes their missiles from Turkey as well. This was a major cause for the creation of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which banned atmospheric testing of any nuclear missiles. Luckily, this somewhat lowered the tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. But of course, that didn't last for very long. Unfortunately, in 1964, Khrushchev fell and was replaced by a man known as Leonid Brezhnev. I don't know how to pronounce that, Brezhnev. And his goal was to re-Stalinize, which of course is terrible news if you're an American. 1965 was also a year in which the U.S. began the involvement in the Vietnam War, which, if you don't know, is known as one of the poorest decisions on our country's behalf, because if you don't believe me, have a talk with a veteran, because when the veterans came back from the war, they were often spit on and treated with no respect at all. The next major event in the timeline was in 1968 with the occurrence of the Prague Spring, led by Alexander Dubček, which ushered in a period of thaw and rebirth for Czechoslovakia. But this, like everything else in this entire era, was completely short-lived when Brezhnev and his commies invaded Czechoslovakia brutally and put an end to this happiness and any socialism there. This was followed by the Brezhnev Doctrine of 1969, which basically said the USSR can invade any country they want, whenever they want, so long as they see it necessary. This really pissed off Americans and set off tensions between America and Russia, and the tensions were through the roof after that. But fortunately, after that came German Chancellor Willy Brandt in 1969, who began improving relations in all of Eastern Europe with his Eastern Initiative. This was known as the Ostpolitik, and yes, it begins in 1969. The 70s began with the Entente, where tensions actually began to go down. Just remember, Entente starts with a D, down starts with D. D, down. Entente, the tensions go down. Nixon took the realpolitik approach when it came to the Entente, and made alliances based on national interests instead of ideological worldviews. Then, in 1972, there was the SALT I Treaty. Brezhnev and Nixon signed a treaty to stop making nuclear ballistic warheads and reduce the number of ballistic warheads to only 200. However, this of course became completely obsolete with the new inventions of more warheads on one missile. In 1975, there was the Helsinki Conference, which legitimized the boundaries for the Soviet Union. And finally, in 1979, was the Solidarity in Poland that triggered a wave of freedom movements in Europe. Go people. And now to Kevin Fukushima for the rest of the war, starting from the 1980s.
The Atlantic Alliance revitalized itself in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher of the UK, Helmut Kohl of Germany, and Ronald Reagan of US. Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979. By the way, she was the first woman Prime Minister, and also she died a few months ago. And as a conservative, she advocated hardline military positions. Helmut Kohl was distinctly pro-American, and he came to power with conservative Christian Democrats in 1982. He aggressively built up the army, and he did so because he thought that they could spend more than the Russians. Ronald Reagan, like Margaret Thatcher, took a hardline stance against the Soviets during the first term of his office. In fact, Ronald Reagan created the Star Wars defense. Reagan announced this in order to pursue high-technology missile defense system. All three of them still believed that USSR was still very dangerous. So now that you know who the Atlantic Alliance was controlled by, now we'll talk about what exactly it did. Basically, the alliance gave indirect support to efforts to liberalize authoritarian communists in eastern states. The Revolution of 1989 ended communist control of Eastern Europe. In Poland, Solidarity was legalized and free elections promised in June of 1989. And by the way, Solidarity was approved by Pope John Paul II. In fact, Lech Walesa became president in 1990, but Solidarity later broke up into many factions. In Hungary, Hungarian leaders proclaimed an independent republic. In Germany, the Berlin Wall came down finally, and that meant Germany was reunified in 1990. Czechoslovakia had their Velvet Revolution, which was inspired by the Berlin Wall falling, and it inspired them to break off of Soviet influence. While Bulgaria did not have an organized reform movement, they too broke away from Soviet control. Czechoslovakia had their Velvet Revolution, which was inspired by the Berlin Wall falling, and it inspired them to break off of Soviet influence. Romania had the only violent revolution, and their oppressive dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, was overthrown and assassinated in December of 1989. And finally, Albania in 1990, they freed themselves of communism. They fell in June 1991. Anyways, let's move on to Mikhail Gorbachev now. He was in his 50s, which is much younger than the other communists, and he created two plans: the Perestroika, which is the economic reboost, which introduced free market trade, and that failed miserably, and the Glasnost, which aimed to open Soviet society by introducing free speech, political liberty, but not much, and while ending party censorship. It was more successful, but it still failed. Gorbachev wanted to reduce East-West tensions. In order to do this, he backed out of the Brezhnev Doctrine, and he signed an INF treaty with Reagan. And this basically made it so that intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe were banned. Okay, let's move on to the fall of Soviet Union. Some of the long-term causes of the fall of the Soviet Union were an economic crisis that spread throughout Europe in the 1970s helped spur on the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the 1980s. Also, the costs of protecting and maintaining the vast empire of the Soviet Union was far too costly. Okay, now let's move on to the coup in Moscow in 1991. Some communist hardliners were frustrated about this whole sequence of events that they decided to try to overthrow Gorbachev. Although this failed because the military refused to crush popular resistance. In fact, Boris Yeltsin defied the Soviet tanks by standing on top of them, and he became a national hero. Although the failure of the coup, it fatally weakened the Soviet Union and Gorbachev, and this basically ended Soviet Union. Finally, Boris Yeltsin and his liberal allies declared Russia independent and withdrew from the Soviet Union. After he withdrew, many of the other countries followed with him. By December 25, 1991, Soviet Union dissolved into 15 different countries. After this whole fiasco, Russia assumed the seat of the Soviet Union in the UN. These republics remained connected for a few years after with the Commonwealth of Independent States, otherwise known as the CIS.